So, welcome to the 25th Annual Capital Conference. This is our virtual edition. It's our goal that the session is about an hour in length. It may be a little longer or we may go shorter. My name is David Stevens. You'll see Glenda Munoz on here, who is our administrative assistant for UIL, all academic things possible. This is our literary criticism, the beginner session. So our presenter is the state contest director and test writer, Mark Bernier, which we're very happy. Mark's been doing this ever since I've been at UIL for many, many years. So that's at least 10 plus years going on. So thanks for all your expertise and all that you do, Mark, and for being here and willing to introduce people to this amazing contest that you put together.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Glenda. I've recognized a number of names as you all greeted everybody, and which means to me that some of you are not beginners, which leads to the question, do I have any beginners with me today? Not a rhetorical question. I'll leave it as, oh, good. Got one at least. Hello, Mark. So in that, and here's another, great. I'll treat it as beginners anyway. And David's a reminder, people can unmute and speak. That includes, good, hello, Katie. Those who've been around a while, and if you don't have David, what happened there? I've disappeared. There you are. And so it is. Everything look good on your end, David?
Yes, looks good.
There we are. Something happened on my end, I guess. And so we'll start this and make it our way through this for about 45 minutes or so, but I need the beginners to stop me at some point when a question comes up. I am given to understand you have a couple of handouts there in one of the boxes that you can look at. We've got a sample test that is a invitational test from last season. And we have a couple of other things, including the overview to the contest, which is found on the website itself, on the UIL Literary Criticism website. So we'll start off right now. This is a test that challenges your students to background information that is found for the most part on in the book, the Handbook to Literature. We are using an edition that's been around a while. It seems as though we're not going to republish anytime soon, this being not STEM, therefore priorities are not prioritized. And so we're using an old edition, which suffices. It does, I need to say this in kind of out of order sort of way, linked, especially the new guys, linked to the literary criticism page there in Austin on the website, or a couple of sources. One is a master list of all, a study aid, I think I have it listed as a study guide that allows everybody to see the listing of terms that I've used in the past. Now, I bring that up now simply because some of the terms you'll find in that listing all the way back 12, 13 years ago are no longer used. That is, the handbook has changed. Indeed, unfortunately, we're working with a handbook that has lost a number of entries, and thus there are cross-references that are dead ends and a few other things about the book that make it not difficult, but certainly a challenge for me as I put together the test. So I've made reference to the handbook itself. You can find easily enough, and certainly on eBay at a good price. Not that I'm in any way promoting. And then the master study guide that I have listed in that right-hand column on the webpage coming out of Austin. On that webpage also is a listing of all the poems I've used in principally section part 2, and part 3 and part 4. So we'll begin an overview of the test. The test is a 90-minute test. It includes a part 4 tie-breaking essay. And I'll start with part 4 tie-breaking essay. It is important in that the rules have it that if a student, a contestant, does not submit a tie-breaking essay, a sincere effort at answering the prompt, there's disqualification involved. That's happened very few times to my knowledge. a real question at state some years ago, but it is that we are caught up in this attempt to measure the student's ability at literary criticism, literary analysis, and to do it by simply turning to multiple choice questions. I usually use the word obscene. That's just not the way to do it. So we have a component of the test. It is the case that the student who finds himself, the contestant who finds herself tied with someone else in the top 6, we pull those essays and we read them and we make a judgment regarding the literary analysis that is undertaken in that response to the prompt. So it is that your contestant, your student, doesn't know the quality of the essay written by his or her competitor at that level. If you both get an 85, the judges, 3 to 5 judges, read that essay, those 2 essays, and make a judgment right then and there. So it should be undertaken by your contestant, your student, as a very serious aspect, not just something you do at the end of the test. What I suggest is that the contestant look at the prompt. That settles the contestant into the chair, getting used to being in a testing situation, read the prompt, read the poem, and that kind of sits back there. Asimov says something about a back burner, and as the student goes through, the contestant goes through parts 1 and 2 and 3, there might be some connections that are made in anticipation of sitting down finally and writing a response to the essay. So part 4 is an essay response in good essay form, addressing the primary source that appears as part of the test. You have a sample test in front of you, or they're easily found by way of the message box there, the click box. And you'll see that the last part, the last page, is a directive how to approach a particular aspect of a particular poem. And it is usually a poem. To find a piece of prose that can be read in short order, and there are in the poems that I choose a lot of concentration of the metapoietic, the alliteration, the assonance, all that sort of stuff, the onomatopoeia, and the tropes and the figures of speech. Whereas in a piece of prose, that stuff is, unless you're reading something from JFK maybe, that sort of rhetorical or literary device concentration's not there. So we resort to, as my predecessor did, Fred, Dr. Tarpley, I think he used maybe 3 pieces of prose over his years. I think I've used 2. So part 4 is guaranteed to be a poem. So that's part 4. I'm slowing down for questions from anybody new or those who have encountered this before and want to offer some advice or correct me on something I've said. Go ahead. The new coaches, if you want to, there are some links. I don't know quite how it's all set up, but if you email me at the DieBurn email, that address you find everywhere now, I will send you a couple of nice responses from past discussions. I've done some sessions wherein we've focused on the tie-breaking essay to give you a sense, give your students, your contestants a sense of what it might be in a way of competition they are up against when we come to writing that essay. Part 2 is a 30-item section. Each item is worth 1 point. One of the files you have access to right now is an answer sheet, and you can see how that's set up. You see that the 65 items are divided into 3 sections. One section of 30 I've made reference to just now. Part 2 has 20 items, and part 3 has 15 items. That adds up to 65. The first 30 worth 1 point each. The parts 2 and parts 3 items worth 2 points each, and all that ends up being 100 points. In the first part, which relies on the handbook to literature for its sourcing, for the most part, are 30 items, as I've already alluded to, and I divided up roughly into 3 sections: 12 questions, 12 items, another 12 items, and then 8 items. We'll start with the 8 items first. On the reading list these past 3 or 4 years, because as I've already referenced, we are not producing in any short order a new edition of the handbook. I have listed the Pulitzer Prize winners and the Nobel Prize winners for literature, the links to those places on the web. In the handbook itself, there are, as appendices, these lists. Hi, I don't know. I got a picture behind me too. How are you? And the list is the Pulitzer Prize winners for fiction, the Pulitzer Prize winner for poetry. Doing well, Bonnie? And David, is everything going well?
It is going great, thanks.
Okay. Things are jumping around on my end, and I think I understand why. A Pulitzer Prize winner for fiction, Pulitzer Prize winner for poetry, and Pulitzer Prize winner for drama. And those lists in the back of the handbook, the edition we're using, only go to 2010. And you can do the math there and say we are short easily 44 recipients of these prestigious awards. So these last 3 years or so, and these links are on the reading list, we go to the web and pull up. Thus, eligible for 8 of the items are these winners from the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize for Literature. So it is now, these last 10 years or so, I've reduced it to 8. Used to be a few more there, but this is, you know, a memory. This is learning by rote, maybe. And do you have your contestants, your students memorize all these guys and gals? No, don't do that. You find other ways around that with any number of these recipients have won more than one. When it comes to the Nobel Prize for Literature, I offer a question, and the response is someone, say, from Germany or from an Hispanic language country, a Latin country, or English, an Anglophone. Anyway, I group in that manner sometimes, so that if I'm looking for an answer that has a Spanish, I'm looking for an answer to a question that has a Spanish answer, a Spanish name answer, all the distractors will be Spanish language names. So it might well be that your contestants study these in groups like that. I usually always include something that might be of interest, that might be found elsewhere in the handbook, or might be found if you did a Google search that makes these people. And I appreciate it, Corey, when you mentioned earlier this year while we were negotiating a question, that you were aware that I do go to current events. And if there is someone we've lost, or if someone's book has been published, you know, after his or her death, or something that occurs that is newsworthy, suddenly that person is on my radar. And if that person's presence is in one of the discussions in the handbook, or is a Pulitzer winner or a Nobel winner, that legitimizes legitimates this attempt to bring a variety of questions to the 8 of the 30 of which I speak now. So there is a Pulitzer for fiction, a Pulitzer for poetry, a Pulitzer for drama, and a Nobel for literature. That's 4. So those are 4 of the 8 items out of the 30 that will be on the test. That leaves 4 in that grouping of 8 that have to do with the personality of an author in some manner, and that includes what he or she has written. So I might ask a question, you might find that in the sample test you have access to now, a question to ask you, which of these authors is responsible for these 5 titles? Or conversely, I might ask, which of these titles belong to one of these authors? I might also ask that you recognize, your student, your contestant recognize the literary time periods. The one in terms of examples I often give is I might ask you or your student, which of the following would not be sitting, as Fred Tarpley used to do, having tea together? And if we have Thomas Kidd and Marlowe and Shakespeare and Johnson, all kind of, and then you got Chaucer sitting there having tea, he's been transported. That is to say, he doesn't belong there. So a knowledge of the literary time periods, much as Bonnie puts together when she puts together her study guide. So you know that Chaucer is Middle English and Shakespeare and company are modern English, at least Elizabethan, and they could not hang together. So those sorts of questions are part of the 8 of the 30. So there'll always be 8 questions that have to do with authors and or their works. Now, it's not random. These authors' names are found in the outline to literary history, which is another addendum in the back of the book, another appendix, excuse me. And it lists, the new ones list world literature, English language literature. Well, that's not right. World literature, British literature, and American literature. I pretty much stay away from the world literature column simply because what we're doing through the handbook and other obvious sort of considerations, we're working with Anglophone literature. That does not discount in terms of influence. I need to reckon with Petrarch, with the sonnet, Dante, with his influence, Homer, and these are world literature folk, but we should know Cervantes, we should know Homer, we should know Dante. So not to ignore that column in the outline of literary history that we'll find in the back of the handbook, but the focus is on the canon represented by the 2 columns. One is American literature and the other is British literature, from which I find reason to include a Fitzgerald or include a Twain or include a Milton, because those names are in there along with a number of their writings. Not all of their writings. I usually say at this point, I think those tables are put together by drunk graduate students. They leave out some stuff, including titles that brought the Pulitzer Prize to a particular person. So there is an opportunity for me to find a name in the outline of literary history and discover whether he or she has 2 or 3 titles listed in that outline literary history, and immediately that person becomes, in addition to his or her being a Pulitzer winner or a Nobel recipient, that he or she is part of the canon as outlined in the outline literary history in the back of the handbook. He or she, that name and those titles are eligible for that balance of 8 questions. So that's a total of 8 questions having to do with writers and their works, and perhaps their association with a particular school, a particular literary or artistic movement. So a question might be, which of these poets is not a metaphysical poet, as we understand them from the 17th century? Which of these poets does not represent, which of these writers of novels does not represent the realistic period in either Britain or in the United States? So those questions, summing up 8 items of the first 30, 1 point each. Questions, please. All right, before I move on to the other 22, category with 11, another category with 11, though that's not a definitive, there's some overlap as we'll talk. I should say at this point that of the first 30, there's always 3 items that I present to you in the, I'll go ahead and call it negative. I've made reference to that master study guide, that aid, that listing of all the terms I've used these past 12 or 13 years. I'm working my way so slowly through that and bold facing the term that is the answer to the not question. Not one of Kenneth Burke's 4 master tropes, not one of Nathaniel Hawthorne's novels, not one of the 9 muses living on Parnassus. So there are always 1 per 10, that is, out of the first 30 items, 1 per page. It's always 30 items on the first 3 pages. There's always 3 nots. They could be a not an author, not a work, not a genre, not a collection of figures of repetition, any kind of category that might exist, I might approach it in the Sesame Street sort of way. One of these does not belong. So that leaves us 22 items. Roughly 22 items I categorize as genre. Sorry, take that back. That's the bridging. One of the 11 of these items are literary terms. They could be the simile, the metaphor, the metonymy, the hyperbole, that range of items that we find in the back of our adopted textbooks, all the while in the glossary, things with which you are familiar, your contestants familiar. So there are about 11 of those. Now, the trick here, and it's not a trick, it's what we do, it is that the definition that I use is virtually word for word from the handbook, which is to say, you might have taught it one way, the adoption you have might word it a different way. A couple of the examples I'll use is I have in the past pulled the definition of sentence out of the handbook. I pulled the definition of poem out of the handbook. I pulled the definition of metaphor out of the handbook, word for word. And we should all have that even as beginning lit critters. But because I'm using the words from the handbook, that confuses the contestant. So it should be that your contestants are aware of something in a very, I won't say general way, but in a very experiential way, having come through the classrooms, but it is the wording that I find in the handbook that I use on the test. So yeah, I know what a metaphor is, teach. No, look at what Bernier is going to pull out of the handbook. That's how it's going to be worded. Now, some of the terms, not alone the literary terms as we're talking about it here, the melopoetic terms such as assonance, consonants, onomatopoeia, alliteration, down that line, but also the tropes and the figures of speech. Some of these discussions in this handbook, alphabetized as it is, are a page and a half long. The student might the potential contestant might well be satisfied with the first discussion, that is the first paragraph. If we don't look deeper into a discussion, we might miss a very legitimate, a very important use of the word. So we might look at romance, and there are 2 or 3 different definitions that I can use and I will use to differentiate. And one has to do with the Arthurian romances. One has to do with the romance in terms of, the 19th century with the Romantic writers. And then, of course, there's the literary genre that we find in the drugstores, or if there are any bookstores left. So it is that when we should not be satisfied as we study, making our note cards or whatever we do, going over it in some kind of rote sort of way, we're not aware that a lot of these literary terms have more than one meaning. And at some point, maybe down the etymological trail, they're related. But in usage, once they get to a particular school of thought or a particular critic, what the heck, Ezra Pound comes up with stuff out of everywhere. We should be aware of the different meanings for some of these literary terms. The other 11, we've got 8 for literary figures with their writing and their association with a group or a movement. We have 11 that are literary terms. The other 11 making up this 30, I associate with the historical aspects of our study of Anglophone literature. And so we're looking at the movements, we're looking at the groups, the agrarians, the Bloomsbury, the spasmodics. We're looking at the Elizabethan age, the Jacobean, however you want to go with that one, the Victorian, the early Victorian. We have to have a handle on those because in terms of influence and resonance, indeed, even as we read novels coming out of the 19th century and how applicable they may or may not be, might or might not be, even into the 21st century, it is that we have to be aware that these writers are not dead white guys, or however the phrase was. I don't know if that's still around, but they are our grannies and our gramps and all our cousins and our uncles whose lived experiences have been put into the literary form, whether it's drama or poetry or the narrative fiction or some kind of cross between them. That is, these people are living, and they lived in a time where influences are what they are. And so we need to know, I feel we need to know that Shakespeare of his 17th century, and as we look at him with Macbeth, very suddenly aware, as was his neck of the woods, very interested in Scotland, because here comes James VI to become, James I to become James, did I do that wrong? James VI to become James I of England, and he brings all this Scottish stuff and interest in the Scots. And so it is that we need to know something about Shakespeare's being in a time that not only is Scotland of interest, we've got by the time we got Jamestown and Plymouth Bay and all that, an interest in a new hemisphere. So the context out of which these literary works come are associated with a person who is a member of a group, who is a member of a time period, who is a member of a literary movement. So these things become important. The items, I usually group usually group the distractors with the correct answer in terms of American or British, which isn't to say there aren't some European-based groups of Parnassians and a few others that the British or the Americans were part of, the Imagists and like that, but I will not cross that pond all that often when I'm asking what group, and the answer is agrarians. I'm not going to include the Cockney school. That way, the youngster, the lit critter studying this stuff understands the locality, the locus, the focus in United States or in Britain, for instance, though we should be aware of things like Coleridge and Emerson, the transcendentalist who crossed the pond. So those sorts of questions will often be along the lines of the canon rather than a hodgepodge of mixed distractors on those questions. These 30 questions worth 1 point each. It might well be you choose not to spend much time with your contestants, forcing them, asking them to find some manner in which to kind of hang on through mnemonic or just plain study. The names, the 8 questions, that the 8 items they have to do with the Pulitzer and the Nobel and such associations as that. But if you approach it pragmatically and see that you get your terms down, and then you get your historical aspects, including genre, get that down 1 point each, you might find yourself not focusing too much on and I'm not saying don't do it as part of the test, focusing on the literary names themselves. I've mentioned 3 times now genre. Genre is both a literary term and it is easily associable with a particular time period. We think of epic, we think old stuff, we think Gilgamesh, we think Homer, we think Virgil. Those are the folk epics, and then we come into the more modern, and we're picking up Milton with his Paradise Lost, for instance, an art epic. It is that the art epic and the folk epic represent a different time period, and I can see myself categorizing that as one of the 11 that have to do with the historical aspects of what we study. Also, I could look at it as what is an epic? What are the characteristics of an epic? And while it's a genre, the characteristics as they are assembled to represent that particular genre, I see as perhaps a literary term. So the genres that are associated with the historical period or with a particular person, or just the very fact that it is that we do pastorals, whether it's the Greeks or the neoclassicists or into the 20th century, that jumps historical lines. So I'll see the pastoral as a term, as either a literary term or a historical term. So those are the first 30, each worth a point. Questions, please. Either type it in there or sing it out. Okay, I'm seeing that we're about halfway through our time, our allotted time. As David says, we can go short, we can go long. That puts me pretty good there with parts 4 covered, the tie-breaking essay, which is essential, especially when you've got a pretty good objective score and someone else has that same score, or as I had this past state contest, 4 people with the same objective score. Writing that essay is of no small consequence. Writing it with the intention of, I won't say impressing, but conveying an understanding of what we've learned from using these literary terms in part 2 and part 3. And we've covered the 30 in part 1. Part 2.
Mark, can I have a question? This is
Yes,
Mark.
yes.
This is Mark Delgado. I have a quick question. For the
Hello,
literary-
Mark. Welcome to the group. How you got a good team kind of setting up?
You know, it's my first year, so I'm just starting up.
Well,
Right.
you let me know with questions, and I don't mind getting on the phone with your group once you get them together in September, October. I don't know what we're doing with Student Activities Conference with any certainty yet, but I hope to see you if that travel allows. Go ahead with your question, Mark.
I appreciate it. So with respect to the literary terms, is it just a definition, or will you give an example of a term and then ask them to identify it?
I'm going to try to answer this one carefully, Corey. I am conscious that the test is short. The time period is relatively short for the test. So you've got 30 questions, and boy, you should get through that in 30 minutes at best. If the definition, Mark, straight from the handbook, if the definition necessarily relies on examples, I will find examples that fit within the aesthetic that I have established, that I'm not taking up half a page trying to offer examples.
Okay.
Now, that's in the first 30, but the same question mark goes to the second 20, especially with the poetry. I will necessarily make reference to an example in the line of poetry that I'm addressing through the question. So I think there's a good chance that in the example sample test that you have in front of you somewhere, that I might have included an example, but it's not rare, it's just unusual because of space considerations. And I don't see one. But in some of the older ones, and Mark, I'll make a note to send you a copy with a couple of examples in it, okay?
Got it. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
A couple of tests with example questions that include examples. How about that?
Sounds
I
good.
guess that was Plosy. All right, does that help, Mark?
That's it. I appreciate it. I'll shoot you an email.
Okay, and beyond that, you got another question at the moment as we make this segue into part 2?
No, I'm good.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, part 2 covers the reading list. It has 20 questions. Each of the items, each of the questions is worth 2 points. And usually I divided up 6 questions, 6 items for the play, 6 items for the novel, and then 8 items for the poetry. You go back to 86, 87, when Dr. Tarpley first started doing this contest, there were times we did not have the poem on the page for the genre poetry. And the student was working with memory. Obviously, there's not going to be the novel on the page, nor an excerpt, and I would think not from the play either. With the play, I do quote directly, and necessarily so. What I do with these 20 questions, back to, as you're taking notes, I'll say it again, the first 6 questions usually with the play, the work of drama, the second with the novel, the work of prose fiction. Fred has in the past, and I'm thinking earnestly or seriously anyway, about maybe a collection of short stories. And then the third section is the poetry, which is 8 questions, usually 2 poems from the reading list, usually. Sometimes excerpted, back when we worked with Robert Browning, not Elizabeth, but Robert, his poetry quite long, Familiarity was expected, but the questions on the test itself were coming just from what I excerpted and put on the page next to the questions being asked. 8 questions there. The balance is usually 5, 3, or 4, 4, something like that. So 6, 6, and 8, that adds up to 20. 20 times 2, this is 40 points in the test. The first 6 questions are drawn from the play. I expect the students, the contestants, to be able to recognize, because especially Shakespeare, while he often, if not always, but often enough to say this is a way to approach it. If he has a main character of some kind, a protagonist working in that central character idea, there's something paralleling that, another character or another character story. The best example, I suspect, is King Lear, where you have the King Lear line and you have the Gloucester line. Those are parallel stories, and thus you can easily put Lear up against Gloucester, and within that you could put one son up against the other son, right? Edgar up against Edmund, and thus the distinction is made and the contrasts are evident, and thus the student, the literary criticisms contestant should be able to, if I quote one of these characters, if I quote Macduff, you should not know it as Macbeth. If I quote Lady Macbeth, it can't be Lady Macduff. You should know the characters and distinguish them. Certainly with Macbeth and the foil character, Banquo. That's why Banquo exists, the argument goes, to give us an idea how it is that someone normal, like Norm in Cheers, would react to the weird sisters, the sisters of fate, the wayward sisters. Here, Macbeth chooses, with a little help from his wife, to react differently. So I expect the students to be able to recognize the voice of the characters, because along the lines you were asking, Mark, here I am giving what you could look at as an example of, by way of definition, who would say this? This is this character's exact words. In that it is Shakespeare, in that Shakespeare next to Chaucer has influenced us. Anyway, won't go into that. It's just incredible. We all know that there are words that are coming out of Macbeth that were not in the language before Shakespeare wrote and put that on stage, which is to say his language is important, which is to say I will find examples of his use of a pun, his use of metonymy, his use of simile, his use of figurative language of some kind, and ask, what is this? So as y'all read, as your contestants read, as your lit creators read Macbeth, look for his use of language in the manner that they, as young literary critics, would recognize an example of hyperbole, an example of litotis, an example of paradox, an example of irony, whether it's cosmic or otherwise, dramatic or otherwise. So it's not only what the characters are saying, it's the language that Shakespeare puts in their mouths that we might appreciate. Willie Loman would have never said it this way, but I'm certain that Malcolm might say it this way, and we should be able to appreciate what Shakespeare has done with the language by virtue of our having studied the Handbook to Literature and recognize that as an example of synecdoche. There are a few plotline questions, but I try without going to the source, that is Cliff's Notes and Monarch Notes. I'm dating myself. I can't remember what the other ones are called. I don't go there to discover what questions have been asked. The questions I come up with are directed by 2 things. One, do they, in my asking and the student, the contestant answering, convey an understanding of the play, the novel, the poems? And 2, can this old man here, who's got to find 4 distractors, find 4 legitimate distractors? So if you're approaching this literature as we have to, sorry, as a central focus, central foci of the contest, we might look at things that happen in terms of plot that could be asked if Bernier can find 4 distractors. So plot line questions, we should be well beyond plot, though there are novels, one close at hand, unfortunately not so much now, that have wonderful plot questions that would require the student, the literary criticism contestant, to understand the novel well to answer it correctly. There are thus questions about character, questions about tone, questions about who said this, and sometimes as we get deeper into the season, questions about motivation. But all of them have to be found in the narrative itself. There has to be evidence in the piece of literature. And as you see, Mark, you're looking at the sample test with the sample answer sheet. The key always has a page number where you can find. And the last thing I want to find the answer, the last thing I want to do is have a contentious moment where I have to defend my choice of the answer when there's another answer that could be argued to be right or wrong. I work with the direct wording of the narrative or the characters, and thus that limits the possibility of ambiguity. The questions for part 1, part 2, part 3 get more difficult through the season. So Mark, I hope the questions in Invitational A and Invitational B don't send your freshman first time student running, but also know that as we get to state, they might be just a little tougher regarding an understanding of the literature especially. The second 6 questions have to do with the novel. I've referenced Macbeth. We are looking at Shakespeare's tragedy of Macbeth. I made a decision very recently, a very hard decision, a difficult decision. I have changed the novel we're working with this year from Twain's remarkable Pudd'nhead Wilson, something I chose last November. And while I was busy trying to find and never did find a good anthology for our poet, kind of put all those considerations on the back burner. And then I came back into the world a little bit, and our world is changing such that I think that I've made a decision and I'm not backing out of it. And it's unfortunate that I have to make the decision because the first decision was made with everything in mind, including language. But we're moved from Pudd'nhead Wilson and we're working with Gatsby. Now, one of the reasons I chose Macbeth was a lot of y'all are familiar enough with Macbeth. It's the shortest of the great tragedies, got a bit of history in it. So it's good fun. Hell, it's got a sword fight or two. But it's also very approachable. And while you'll read at some point, maybe that Coleridge thought it was a tragedy, there's some wonderful comedy in there. But that aside, you gotta have the comic relief, I guess you might call it. It is short and approachable. So too is Gatsby, and so too is that most of y'all have spent a lot of time with it. Indeed, just an aside here, the last time I spent a lot of time with Gatsby was with William Harmon, who is as you well know, the fellow who took over the handbook some years ago. He was a visiting prophet. A&M there in College Station, and I took an undergraduate course in American Survey, and I took a graduate course in poetics with him. Wonderful man. I think he's emeritus now, but we went through Gatsby, and Gatsby came alive. And I'm hoping that y'all as coaches can do that. One of the ways you can do it is keywords here. If you're writing down keywords, Stephen Colbert just dropped her name. Stephanie, who's the Don't Blink girl? Yeah. Okay. And So Stephen Colbert and Reading Rainbow, LeVar Burton. It's nice to have your daughter around. She's a Doctor Who fan, but Carey Mulligan. If you keywords, Carey Mulligan, she's got a great new movie out. I don't want to see it, scared the heck out of me. Carey Mulligan, Stephen Colbert, and Gatsby. There's a wonderful interview there you might find useful, very useful, introducing your kiddos to Gatsby. But Gatsby, Priestley, J.B. Priestley, one of his characters in one of his detective stories, one time he walks into the drugstore and he says he saw Gatsby on the shelf there and said, it's time to read Gatsby again. And for me, this is a good time for reasons that I've alluded to, and it's a damn good novel. And I think we can find ourselves enjoying something of the same thematic concerns that permeate Pudd'nhead Wilson, in that we try to discover what it is to be an American in a time where you might be just outside your comfort zone. So Gatsby, know your characters, know the setting, and because it's a time period thing, we might need to know something about the Jazz Age. I won't ask direct questions about it, but it might well be that the students will understand that when Daisy opens that closet, or when that closet contents are revealed to her. Another little side here, Gatsby with Robert Redford, that was the last movie I ever saw at a drive-in theater. There you go. And that closet, when it opened up with all those different colors, with Gatsby with his yellow car and everybody else has either a black or a white one. These things might have to be explained to your students, like rotary phones and those sorts of things. So it is that I think you have a real opportunity through the season to find my questions, which will do with character and quotable passages from the characters themselves, and a recognition that it's not a story about Gatsby, as well you know, it's a story about Nick Carraway, who tells his story about Gatsby. So you'll have allusions, whether they're immediate or historical or topical, Hopalong Cassidy, whatever it might be, there's enough there for me to find questions in that novel. Questions as I look at the clock, getting into the last two areas of the test, part 3 of part 2 and part 3 in toto. Any questions? Mark, anybody? Okay, the last 8 questions in part 2 are questions that have to do with the poetry selections. We're looking at Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Early on in my search for an anthology, I was told there was a wonderful anthology. Then, as has happened several times over the past few years, I'm told there are not enough copies. When we did John Donne a few years ago, I was told that there were copies and they ran out and they had to reprint it in Europe. And then they put the shipping on a boat instead of an airplane. These are the things you don't need to know about, but they do play into what has happened this year. I have found a very cheap, inexpensive copy of, and you can find them anywhere, there's not much change, if anything, of Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese. But I've also attached to, thanks for your help, Linda, attached to the reading list itself, 6 poems that are not from Sonnets from the Portuguese, so that we have a sampling of poetry beyond her favorite genre, the sonnet. 2 of the 6 are, I believe, if I remember, sonnets. So we're going to be looking mostly at sonnets. And they are not replete with the use of literary, gosh, I hate these terms, devices, techniques, these aspects of storytelling that find themselves in the lyrical expression we call poetry. But there's enough there to recognize her use of imagery, which is to say, when I sat down to the sonnets, and when I sat down to about 40 poems I found online and chose from them, it was with a notepad. And I go through the poem. And if I could find 6 or 8 words, expressions, features, characteristics to ask questions about, those are the poems I picked. probably the one I didn't pick for that reason is Let Me Count the Ways. There's not a lot to ask about that, which doesn't mean it won't be on a test, and which doesn't mean I don't use a particular poem mark in invitational B and it doesn't show up again at state. Just because I've used it once doesn't mean it doesn't show up again. It's that I picked these poems because there are 3 to 5 to 6 potential questions for each of them. Some of her most beautiful poems, I'd be hard pressed to find multiple choice questioning with 4 legitimate distractors. So as you read the beautiful poetry, much as your student might read it, your contestant might read it in a test setting, don't read the poem, read the questions first, or look through the poem for those things that stand out, the metaphors, the similes, the apostrophes, that sort of thing, and then put them in the full context of her love poetry, because it will be difficult to find questions that have to do with theme or tone, since most of them are in this sonnet sequence doing the same thing. But there are plenty of opportunities for the poems I've chosen to find questions that have to do with the items that you might find or should find, will find in the Handbook to Literature. So those are the 20 items, the 20 questions. And you might notice, and sorry, Mark, I keep calling on you for reasons that should be obvious. I can remember your name. I don't ask questions in terms of questions. It's a philosophical thing. I don't know the answer to any of them, but I can construct a sentence leaving off the last word or so that has an opportunity for the contestant to find the best fill in the blank at the end. So what I've done with Barrett Browning's poetry is pick the ones I can work with, finding 5 answers, one of them correct in terms of it filling in the blank the way I worded the item, which is what I've done in part 3. Part 3 is 15 items. It's comprised of 15 items worth 2 points each. I am very aware that the student doesn't have all day, so I try to keep it to around 4 poems. That means about 4 questions for each poem. And these are poems that I think I'm doing a good job of finding a level playing field. They're not the poems you're going to find just anywhere in the anthology, or they might not be the poems that you choose in an anthology adopted for a particular grade level. I'd like to have everybody 1A through 6A come to these poems fresh. And so I try to sample, say, in the invitational and district, more along the lines of the how poems are put together, sort of, excuse that phrasing, metaphors and similes. And then when we get deeper into the season, maybe start picking up things like tone and theme. But all of them hopefully are challenging enough, but not unlike what I've suggested to do with Barrett Browning's poems, but you already have spent time with them, is you come to these poems and forget about it reading them, read the questions first and then go to the poems. The contrast between the poems in part 2 and the poems in part 3. Poems in part 2, I expect that you have studied them thoroughly. I will not give any footnotes, any kind of marginalia that will help you with a particular word in Barrett Browning's poem. The best thing to do is always have an Oxford English Dictionary beside you. And if for instance, in Shakespeare, if they call them the Weird Sisters, you better look up weird the way it was used in Scotland in the 16th and 17th century. It's not the way we use weird. So you should be familiar with vocabulary within the context of the time period in which the piece is written by the person who's using it. In part 3, I will footnote as I feel that is fair. One note on part 4, we've talked about it at the beginning. What I've done these past 7 years or so is use as the tie-breaking essay prompt one of the selected poets' poems not on the list. So for invitational A that I write, invitational B that I write, and the district test, the poem we find in part 4 will be a Barrett Browning poem, not one of the 14 on the reading list this year. That gives the student an opportunity to, as you've worked with him or her, the contestant has a familiarity with Barrett Browning well enough to answer a question about this particular poem, because especially the chances are it's part of that sonnet sequence, it might well be that if it becomes very familiar and the student can concentrate on writing about the poem. Which reminds me, as you end up being a judge, if you have no dogs in the fight, as the idiom goes, this is not ready writing. We're not judging the essays in terms of literary style. We're looking at literary analysis. And I usually say Seven Lakes, they usually send to state and come in first, second, third, fourth. Anyway, and they are first generation speakers of English, these young Vietnamese. And the idioms they might use in their tie-breaking essays are not the idioms of someone who might win a ready writing contest. So we're not looking for perfect expression. We're looking for, especially because it's a essentially first write, we're looking for content when referencing the poem when we judge the tie-breaking essay. So thank you very much, Amanda. Do you see that, David? I thought we had everything changed. Did you refresh, Amanda? We'll double check that, Amanda, and make sure it reads. Okay, thank you. I think we tried to catch it everywhere. Again, I made this decision between lunch with my Stephanie and conversation with my Allison on Father's Day. I just don't want to have coaches out there having to defend something that I am 300 miles away, made the decision. So thank you, Amanda. We'll double check on that. That is, make sure it reads Gatsby. Hey, Mark. Yeah, there's that. There's that, but I think I've changed everything, including the temporary file. Yes, question. I can't hear you.
I was gonna say, that's the link that still says Pudd'nhead Wilson.
Oh, okay. Temporary, okay, thank you very much. All right, that's my delivery. I think I've covered everything. The first part is 1 point each, 30 questions divided into 3 sections. You got another question, Mark?
No, I'm good, thank you.
11 questions on genre, excuse me, take that back. 11 questions on literary terms, 11 questions on historical aspects of being in the world as an experiential being in the writing or writing in the time period, and genre crosses both those sections. So a genre could pick up in the first 11 or the second 11, and then 8 having to do with writers themselves, some aspect of their being in a canon or contributing to a canon, which isn't to say they will be on the test page, as you'll see in the sample test, all lumped together. They are intermixed, the 8, the 11, and 11. The second part covers 3 genres. This year, we're doing Shakespeare's Macbeth. We're working with Fitzgerald's Gatsby, and we're working with Barrett Browning's poetry. Real quick, that list I referred to of all the poems I've used over the past dozen years or so, there is a listing of 3 Barrett, there is in the listing 3 Barrett Browning poems. That might be of some help to you, though it's been years. It was around 7 or 8 years ago that I kind of fell in love again with Barrett Browning and used some of her poetry. And so part 3, random poems. No, you can look at the poems on that list I have available to you. And you see that perhaps these are representative of approaches to poetic expression that I cannot find with ease an anthology that will make everybody feel comfortable. What I mean there is Sharon Olds is incredible. Wendy Cope is incredible. But women of the 20th and the 21st century, they can write some poems that are earthy, as do the Latina poets do. So I find my way into the canon and find an individual poem to explore, wishing I could pick out 20 of her poems or 20 of his poems and do that, but they don't pass muster when we have a bunch of freshmen taking the test. So those 4 parts constitute the test as I make them and as I believe the vendors try to emulate. Once again, I write invitational A, I write invitational B, district, region, and state. I have a listing of all the literature that we've used since 1986, 87. And the last 2, if I remember, little boxes invite you to send suggestions. And I look at all suggestions. It doesn't take much of an effort. Not many people send, but as I've already suggested, it's difficult to find some things in print in the quantity that will keep everybody happy. So please send me questions at that dieburn@sbcglobal.net. And if you want an updated printout, the master list of terms tested in Word rather than in HTML as you have it in front of you, or PDF, I guess it is, sorry, send me and I will send to you. Thank you very much. Darren, I missed your question. Did you catch it, David?
Yes. I just want to make sure TEP was aware of the change.
Yes, David is handling that for the most part, and I'm following up on that. Thank you, Darren.
Yeah, we're just waiting on pricing and information that they can put on their website to confirm.
And again, it is each of the genres on the reading list, a little qualifier, if you will. It reads that any unabridged copy of the novel or the play or the poems for that matter, fine. What helps is that on the answer key, I always have a page number or a line number or something like that, so that it is that we can get directly to the primary source in a question that might have to do with my wording of a question or failing to put the right answer among the 5. Thank you, Darren. I understand, but one of my favorites, Darren, is Letters from the Earth. And I think Twain would, from the grave or anywhere he might be haunting, be happy to make the estate unhappy. Good man he is. Honest man he is, Twain. I'm good, David.
All right.
Let me say, especially to the new folk, we have a poetry explication session tomorrow and Friday. The handout for both those sessions is the same one. I'll pick from. A lot of it has to do with my mood. I don't want to say that. How I feel about a poem at the time I look at it on the page when I'm doing this tomorrow afternoon. Yes, Bonnie, it is recorded. What I have to say about explicating poems for the test, I'm not explicating poems for posterity, for publication. This is what I look for when I make out the multiple choice questions. What I have to say about the poems in the handout that we'll look at tomorrow and Friday applies to what I have to say to them about them, applies to Barrett Browning's poems also. Though we won't be covering any Barrett Browning poems for maybe legitimately obvious reasons. And Thursday, I'll do what I can to be ready to talk Gatsby, as well as Barrett Browning, and of course, Billy. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Mark. We appreciate you presenting for us today and look forward to the rest of your sessions this week.